This conference will now be recorded.
And we also, as you can see, we run workshops like today's workshop. Today's workshop, Creating an Outstanding Proposal, is going to allow two of my wonderful colleagues to share their expertise in grant writing and thinking about grants projects with all of you. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce them. Gigi Naglak is our Director of Programs, and James Kirkland is our Program Officer at the Council, and they're going to tell you a little bit more about how to create an outstanding proposal today. So welcome to all of you, and we're so glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Karin. I really appreciate your welcome. Hi, everybody. My name is Gigi Naglak. I've met many of you, but not all of you, so it's great to see your faces, see that you're there, etc. At this moment. I am the Director of Programs, as Karin mentioned, which means I oversee all of our programs at the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, the largest of which is, in fact, our grant program. I am joined in all of these endeavors, but particularly in our grant program by James Kirkland, our Program Officer. James, you want to say hello?
Hello, everybody. My name is James Kirkland. I'm Program Officer at the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. My primary responsibility is a lot of the grant administration, so I do a lot of the day-to-day work on the grants and also assist Gigi with program development and evaluation as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, James. As James said, he does really handle a lot of the day-to-day aspects of grants, both including the application part, but also the administrative part. So once you actually have a grant, all the steps in between there. So he, in most cases, will be your primary contact if you're applying for a grant from NJCH. I do handle work on the guidelines, compliance issues, larger sort of program development questions, and I do absolutely assist with day-to-day operations. So you'll probably at some point in time have an interaction with each of us. Thankfully, if you email grants@njhumanities.org, you get both of us. So whoever's available to answer your question first, we'll get back to you as quickly as possible. So this particular workshop, Creating an Outstanding Proposal, was developed to help our grantees, so people who are applying for a grant from NJCH, to prepare competitive grant proposals. But a lot of the information that I'm going to talk about today is really relevant to other grants as well, and I'm going to try to point that out as much as possible. I should mention also that throughout this workshop, I'm going to use the words proposal and application interchangeably. For our purposes, they are the same. The application, we use an online application system, which I'm sure some of you at least have some familiarity with. I know that some of you have some familiarity with. So that is what I'm talking about when we talk about either a proposal or an application. Just going back to our application specifically, we are in the middle of our first grant round, but please do note the first grant round of this year, the 2021 year for us. Please note that if you did not submit your LOI by last evening, it is now too late for this first round. The deadline was yesterday at 11:59 p.m. If you tried to submit and had trouble in any way, you need to get in touch with us right away so that we can fix that. Our next round opens on February 1st, and if you go to our website, njhumanities.org, and go to the grant section, you can look at the detailed sort of step-by-step deadlines for that grant round. Okay, so I'm gonna ask those of you who are on this call right now, if you have your camera on, you can actually use your hand. If you do not have your camera on or would prefer not to use your hand, you can use the little raise my hand button on GoToMeeting. And if you are here just via phone, just think really hard in my direction, and I'm sure I will get your answer. I'm curious to see how many of you are currently in the process of applying for a grant from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. Raise your hand if so. Oh, lots. Yeah. Okay, hands down. How about thinking about applying maybe in the next round or next year or something like that from NJCH? Again, Not quite as many. Okay, great, great. And how many, are any of you here just because you want to learn more about applying for grants generally? Awesome, yeah, a few of you too. Great, well, thankfully we have something for all of you here today. So that's excellent. It's just very helpful to know what everyone's thinking about at this moment. So today's agenda, we're gonna review what are the different parts of a proposal or application. We're going to start taking a pretty deep dive into what makes a proposal outstanding, as the title of this workshop indicates. We're going to go step by step through sort of preparing a proposal using an example, using a case study of an actual funded project from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. We're going to finish this up talking about some of the areas that we see proposals not succeed, areas where proposals fall down. There's some pretty common ones and then some less common ones. We'll talk about some of that. We're going to wrap it up with some final thoughts and leave, my goal today is to leave a lot of time at the end for Q&A. I am going to fly through this as quickly as I can. It might seem like I'm sort of railroading, I don't know, just speeding through. But my goal is to sort of cover a lot of basics and then use your information, your questions to see where we need to spend a little more time, okay? So keep your questions as you're sort of thinking them through. Use the chat function within this. That's the little talking bubble up in the corner of your screen. James is going to be monitoring the chat. If it's a quick question, he will try his best to answer it. In certain cases, we're just going to put the questions off until a little bit later. We will get to as many questions as we possibly can today. When you registered for this workshop, you should have received a couple of documents that I'm going to be referencing during the workshop. If you have them and you'd like to use them, they're great places to take notes, to like write yourself some thoughts along the way. If you don't have them, you will be able to get them. So don't worry about that. You can, of course, always use them later as well. Make as many copies as you want. Share them with all of your friends. Give them as gifts this holiday season as you wish. I know everybody would want those under the Christmas tree. Hello. Just so you know, we have created a new section in our website where you'll be able to access recordings of past grants, workshops, or any kind of workshop actually, and materials from those workshops as well. It's on the resources page of our website, njhumanities.org/resources. Also, if you go to the footer of any page on our website, you'll see a little icon that says resources with a little magnifying glass. Click on that. In the yellow section, there's one that is called something like webinars and materials. I'm pretty sure that's what that is, what it is called. It's called something very similar to that, if not. So that'll give you links to past webinars. This one will be up in the next few days, so you'll be able to access materials if you don't have them right now. Okay, I should mention that those worksheets that I referenced are not application materials, right? They don't exactly replicate application materials. They're meant to help you think through as you're beginning the process of writing your application. They are particularly helpful if, as so many of us are in the situation of doing, you're working with a committee to put together a program, but then one person has to sit down and actually write the darn thing. This is a great way to sort of gather your thoughts and make notes prior to writing your actual application. Okay. During this presentation, I will be regularly asking for feedback from you. I see that people have already started the clickety-clack of the chat functionality. We will also have opportunities. You are welcome to sort of try to flag us down like this, using your hand, unmute yourself. We'll be able to unmute ourselves a little bit later. Write a question directly to one of us, anything like that, if you're having difficulty getting questions to throughout the time. James is going to be monitoring the chat. He'll provide links to things as I talk about them, answer questions when they come up, etc. There are moments where I may ask you to think about something or reflect on something, and we may have a few moments of silence on the webinar. I know that can be really weird on a webinar, but let's please go with me, live in the weirdness, We have a lot of experience at this point with living in weirdness, so I think we're all better suited for this now than we were 6 or 8 months ago. But I'd really love to hear your feedback and your thoughts along the way. So related to that, let's try a little question together. Again, put your thoughts into the chat. What are you hoping to learn today or review today? What questions do you have? What do you hope I cover? Put any ideas that you might have into the chat. Hopefully, I have already anticipated all of your questions and I will answer them in advance. But if I haven't, I can also, potentially name things on the fly. How proposals are evaluated. Yep. That's a great one. Learning from scratch, awesome. You're going to be a pro by the end of this, Sybil, a pro. Okay. Yep, we're going to be going a lot over the whole process of application and what needs to be included. In fact, that's actually where we're going to be starting.
Yeah, somebody has questions about support materials as well, like what should be included, how to write strong proposals. This is a good thing I think you'll cover is, I'm interested to hear where things go wrong with proposals.
Yes, we'll be talking about that quite a bit.
Keywords and language of grant writing to make a proposal stand out from the pile.
It's great. Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in learning the best way to stay organized during the process and what funders typically look for when reviewing proposals.
That's great. Mm-hmm. Sure. Oh, I love these questions. These thoughts are great.
Yep, learning what elements of the application stand out when being reviewed. So we'll cover a lot of these aspects.
Wonderful. Yep, this is really, really great. I see someone talking about when we're throwing your hat into the arena on a larger scale, right? We're a federal funder, which is a little different when you're writing for a statewide organization, writing for a federal funder. The effort is a little different than when you're writing for your local or county. That's wonderful. Everyone, everything everyone has said. That's great. I love it. Well, I don't want to keep you waiting any longer. Please don't hesitate to throw ideas into the chat. James is going to be following this. And then, like I said, at the end, we'll have plenty of time for questions as well as throughout. Okay. So without further ado, I want to share my screen with you. So that we can start chatting, right? Okay. So let's start with some basics here. I want to talk about the components of a proposal, okay? Because this is a really big and important part. And this is one of those things that goes that relates to a lot of different types of proposals, not just the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. So briefly, there's some basic proponents that you see in a lot of different kinds of grant proposals. One is going to be your organization and project information. This is the stuff that you don't even really have to think about, right? It's the name of your organization, your EIN. In our case, you're required to submit a DUNS number, your address, email address, all that stuff. For the project information, this is going to be the title of your project, how much are you requesting, what's your grant period, the sort of basic stuff that you have to fill in first. The next section is your narrative. This is where you have the opportunity to go into a lot more detail about your proposed project. Some narratives, like ours, ask multiple questions and ask you to answer them. Other grants might have a single narrative. So they ask you to say, like, describe your project and just throw up one big narrative, and those are usually quite a bit longer. There's a section, of course, for your budget, where you're going to talk about what expenses you're looking to have paid for in your grant, with your grant. In our case, there's sort of two parts to the budget. There's the grant funds that you're requesting, and then what we call matching, what most people call matching funds or cost share. Those are how you're going to match the funds coming from outside of the funding that you're requesting. We'll be going into a lot of detail about the budget. Often along with a budget, there's some space for what is called a budget narrative or a budget explanation. So that space allows you to give a little more context around your budget so that you're sure when you ask for, this amount of money for this thing, the reviewers really understand what that thing is and how you came to that number that you're asking for. Your project team is a separate section in our application. It includes the required humanities scholar or expert. Sometimes the project team in other applications is asked for just as part of the narrative. So there could be some variation on that, but usually who is going to be involved in doing the work is something that you will be asked in your application. And then finally, there's usually attachments of some sort. Some of them are required. In our case, that includes things like your financial statement or 990 for your organization. It requires proof of your 501c3 nonprofit or government status. And then there's often supplemental materials. These are usually optional, sometimes required. And those would be additional documents that will give information about your proposal that aren't included in the text of your narrative. So for example, as an example, if you're proposing an exhibition, right? It might be some sample text from your exhibition, an exhibition outline, a sample, what's it called? Oh my goodness, where you explain what an object is. Oh my goodness, I come from the museum world and I'm just blanking on this word. I apologize. Those are the kinds of things that would happen in your supplemental materials. Every type of application is going to be very slightly different, but they tend to be the component parts of any application that you're doing. Here. All right. So when you have all these different parts, it's important to think about what is going to make a proposal actually competitive, right? Everybody's going to give all of these parts, otherwise they can't make their proposal. So what's going to actually make it competitive? So I want to talk a little bit about these different aspects of a competitive proposal, very importantly. Matching the funding priorities of the foundation to which you are applying. These types of priorities are usually listed on the website and or in the guidelines of the foundation to which you are applying. If you are applying to the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, they are in both places. So an organization will talk about what areas are their funding priorities. Matching your grant to the funding priorities is a critical aspect to success of your proposal. Following the guidelines, also extremely critical. We, generally speaking, are not asking you to follow guidelines precisely to be jerks. We are not trying not to be jerks as much as possible. There is an issue of equity here in this. We want to make sure that everybody has the same standards to which they would be held, so that we're not favoring one organization over another unintentionally. It also helps us to understand that your organization has the capacity to manage a grant project. If you have managed your grant proposal, then you've shown that you have a certain capacity to manage this. This is particularly important for us because we are the stewards of federal funds, and there's a lot of requirements that come along with managing and using federal funds. So we want you to know that you can follow the guidelines and do what you need to do with your funds. A competitive proposal will provide a clear description of the project. This is what I refer to as the what. What are you doing? It is surprising how often this part is sort of pushed to the side or less well dealt with compared to the why, which I'll get to in a moment. We need to know what you're doing. A clear description is the critical aspect of that. And of course, then we get to the why, right? And there's kind of two parts to the why. You need to make a case for the value of the project to the intended community, right? The value of the project to your audience. This is what I think of as the why for your audience, right? But there's also a value for the project to your organization itself. This is the why part two, related to your mission and the work of your organization. All of this is sort of a balance between the what and the why a balance between the needs of your organization and the parts and the capacity of your organization, the expertise of your organization, as well as the needs and interests of your audience. A slightly different way to think about that balancing act between what and why and your audience and your organization is a sort of a two-part question that I've started to use, which is, why are you doing this? And why are you doing this? So why are you doing this program? How is this program useful in addressing whatever need you wish to address? And what particular expertise do you have in addressing that issue? So, all right. Let's start talking a little bit about how you're going to actually create your proposals. There's sort of 3 steps that I'm going to advocate on this particular workshop to create a proposal. You're going to outline the program and program components, outline your budget, and outline your narrative. What order you do this in is really up to you. However, I do actually recommend this particular order. Outline the program first, then go to your budget, and then go to your narrative. So it's hard to do anything with a proposal if you don't know what the program is. So obviously that's going to have to come first. But starting with your budget rather than starting with your narrative can often help to ground your proposal in very concrete details. Realistically, you're going to need to go back and forth between the narrative and the budget a number of times as you finalize details, right? You want to make sure those 2 things speak to each other. And I mentioned that we're going to use a specific example to sort of break down what these different components are and some of the questions that you need to think, that you should think about when you're building out your grant proposal. Our sample program is going to come from the Piscataway Public Library, and it is called Piscataway Stories, an Inclusive History Project. As I mentioned before, this is an actual grant proposal. This was a funded project. They applied for an incubation grant and received funding for it in 2019. They've actually pretty recently finished up this project. And I'm looking forward to what happens in the next process, or next part of the process for them. So I'm going to show you what these are actual words from their particular proposal that I'm going to read here for you. 1 second, sorry. Sorry about that. This project will assist the Piscataway Public Library in conceptualizing and developing the local history collection in a manner that is reflective and inclusive of the diverse community the library serves. So that is the short description of their project that we received at the very beginning of their application. I think that in fact came from their LOI. So just from this note, this one sentence, I can note that it immediately hits 2 of the characteristics of an outstanding proposal that I talked about already. So one of the things we talk about is hitting the funding priorities of a foundation, right? So I've circled on this, highlighted on this, where our primary goals for our grant program is. The most competitive grants will support 1 or more of these primary goals: to build new audiences for the humanities, to bring people of different perspectives and backgrounds together, to explore new program models, and to create lively humanities opportunities around the state. And you can see they are looking to build new audiences, right? They want to make sure that all of the people of Piscataway are recognized in their local history collections. As you read more, you'll find that they're looking to bring people of different perspectives and backgrounds together, explore a new program model. They're looking to do this in a new way than they have in the past. And I very much hope they will, in fact, create lively humanities opportunities. So they're hitting a number of our funding priorities. I also know that they've paid attention to the guidelines because they applied for an incubation grant. This is a really simple one, of course. But we have these 2 types of grants: incubation grants and action grants. Incubation grants support planning and development, which is the phase that this project is in right now. So I know immediately that they have internalized these questions and made good decisions for themselves about how to apply. Okay, so this is a slightly longer description of what the library is planning to do as part of their project. If you have the worksheet that I sent about writing your proposal, the proposal worksheet, you might want to pull that out or pull that up on your computer, however you're planning on doing that, because this is where we're going to start talking in detail about those kinds, about the things on that worksheet specifically. So briefly, I'm going to kind of fly through this. The library, the Piscataway Public Library, is home to a collection about the early history of Piscataway. The library staff has maintained this existing collection, but it's been 30 years since there's been any additions to it. And in the meantime, demographic shifts in Piscataway have seen major changes to the population who are not represented. Their history is not represented in this. Immigrants from all over the world have settled in Piscataway, and they're just not shown in this local history collection. Significant gaps have been identified in the collection. There's a strong need to both add to materials and update it to reflect the population today of Piscataway. The library also notes that people aren't using the local history collection in the way that they used to. So they want to increase access to and engagement with the collection for many, many different kinds of people. And also, in a broader sense, reinforce the library's role as an institution that preserves local knowledge and cultural heritage. They are well suited to do that work. So what we're going to start talking about is what is this project and what are the component pieces that just from this little bit of information we already have as part of this. If you have some thoughts about particularly the component pieces, what are the things that are going to be part of this grant application? Can you imagine as part of this grant? This is entirely speculative, but please put any ideas that you have right now into the chat. I'll leave this description up on the screen in case anybody wants to reference it during this time. Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I wanted to give you a little more. So this is going to be step 1, outlining our program components, right? You're going to have 1 to 2 sentences about what this project is and a bullet pointed list of its component pieces. Does anybody have any ideas? Okay. Sure. There was a request to repeat the question. We're going to think about the proposal that the Piscataway Public Library has made about their local history collection, and think about what they might be including as part of their grant program based on what we know so far. I see that Rachel mentioned learning local area demographics. Yep, absolutely. Gathering together information, right? About who's there now. What else might they want to do? Collection survey. That's a great point, right? What is in their collection right now and what is missing, right? Identifying gaps. Acquiring updated pieces for the collection. Maybe collecting new materials. Yep, more diverse materials came up as well. Yeah, I love these ideas.
Community outreach and marketing to get new people in the door.
Getting new people in the door, absolutely. Marketing, community outreach would be 2 tactics for doing that, absolutely.
And you know, the community outreach was actually a huge component of that project in particular.
It sure is. We're going to get to that in a moment. I love these ideas, and thank you to everybody who just sort of jumped in with some thoughts about this, right? Okay, so I wanted to jump out of this for a moment and go actually into one second. Stop sharing this screen for a second and share something else. As you know, I sent along these lovely worksheets, and I want to show you. I took information from the proposal that Piscataway Public Library created to share with you so that you could actually see it. Okay. So our first effort was to create a one to two sentences, right, about this project. So this project will assist the Piscataway Public Library in conceptualizing and developing their local history collection in a manner that is reflective and inclusive of the diverse community the library serves, right? That's our one sentence description we already went over. Important that this connects well to an incubation grant because it's about conceptualizing and developing. And they mention also that they want to create a collection that is reflective of and inclusive of a more diverse community. Component pieces in this, you have mentioned several of these. They want to engage a diversity scholar to lead this planning process. So they want to bring somebody in from outside to help them in the planning process. They want to gather community inputs through public events. They're planning on some public events to gather information from the community about the collection. They're definitely looking to identify new collection opportunities, to present the collection publicly to audiences to increase engagement, and also thinking about ways to feature the collection within the library. So there's multiple parts. This is a summary. This is not everything that they wrote in their proposal. But these component pieces are the pieces that we think about when you're thinking about your project, right? So whatever your project is that you're imagining applying for or that you're in the process of applying for, taking a moment, taking 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to sit there and say, what is my project in a very short 1 to 2 sentences? If I have to explain this, it's the elevator pitch, right? How can I summarize that well? And then what are the component parts, right? Do we need to bring somebody else in? Are we creating an exhibition? What are the pieces of that? This component piece list is going to help us get to our next step, which is going to be creating our proposal budget. So without further ado, I'm going to share the budget with them. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to again ask you all to hop onto your chat. And again, knowing very little about this proposal, what are things that they might need that require money, right? Whether that's internal money or external money, what might they be asking for when they start thinking about sharing, getting funding?
I got a good one. Cost for the scholar.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Cost for the scholar.
Yes, the scholar. Great. That's a cost for sure. Anything else?
Yep. Cost for public events, so refreshments, etc. That always helps to entice people in.
Sure does. You can't do humanities without pizza and cookies.
Consultant fee.
Consultancy, sure. Yep.
Printing and marketing costs.
Mm-hmm.
Someone put renovations and additions.
Possibly.
So
Possibly.
Not something we would really cover in our grant.
There would be certainly be limitations on how much we would be able to cover. Depends if it's, renovation to signs or renovation to the building. There would be pretty big differences between those two things.
Printing, cost to update materials, some marketing, equipment potentially.
Yep.
To host the archives. Travel expenses.
Yep. Travel expenses. That's an interesting one. What brought travel expenses to mind for whoever said that? If you can give some more info.
Here's a good one. Possibly staff time for time devoted to project.
Absolutely. 100%. This is going to take a lot of time for this staff.
Here's a good one. Cost share for staff volunteer time to help at events.
Ooh, somebody knows the New Jersey Council for the Humanities very well. I love this. Yes. Great. in the interest of time, I'm going to jump us into the budget and show you some of the expenses that actually came up in their budget. So this is a copy of the budget worksheet that I sent along. And sort of part one of this, what I call section A, is a listing of expenditures, and they're sorted into the 4 categories that we have in our budget. Again, if you're applying for a different type of grant, there's going to potentially be different type of categories. Everybody's got a slightly different one. We tried to keep it as simple as possible. Others have a lot more. So a way to handle this, first making a list of the needs that you have, and then assigning value to those needs, and then going and sort of sorting them into the component parts of the budget form is the way to do this. So we have 4 categories, as I mentioned. Project personnel are the primary people involved in the project. We're particularly interested in people who are involved in the project long-term, rather than the people who might be there only for like 1 or 2 short moments. Travel and lodging, this should be pretty self-explanatory. Anything related to travel, anything related to needing to stay somewhere at a particular moment, and any costs that might be associated with like a per diem cost or anything like that. So that's the travel and lodging section. We have not been getting anywhere near as many expenses in those recently, given that so much has gone online due to coronavirus, which is fine, of course. Supplies and services. Supplies are stuff, obviously. Services are people or specific services that might need to be part of your project. There's often overlap between services and project personnel. One way to think about this is who's going to be having like long-term content implications versus who hiring a photographer, for example, that if you wanted to have your event photographed is great. You are welcome to use that as an expense. That's more of a service than a project personnel. Although honestly, we respect what your thoughts are about this. So as long as you give us an explanation, it's not going to be a big problem for us. So the stuff and the activities, right? That's the supplies and services. And then finally, our final category is indirect costs. This is the most complicated one. These are administrative costs, overhead costs, the costs of doing business, as I say. These are expenses that cannot be connected to a specific project easily, but are costs that are sort of associated with the work of an organization. In a lot of cases, it's the how much does it cost to do your bookkeeping? How much do you need to have the lights on, right? How much do you need for toilet paper? Those are the costs of doing business in your space. Many organizations opt for a percentage of their grant to be covered in these indirect costs. For us, we would normally expect that to be somewhere between 10 and 20%, but there's a lot of variation on this, and you can certainly speak to us about your grant in particular. So we've assigned values. Actually, before I get into that, a reminder at this point to review your guidelines for eligible and ineligible expenses. There's not a lot of expenses that are ineligible through the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, but there definitely are some. For example, we can't pay for alcohol. So if you need wine, you're going to have that come from somewhere else, sadly. Also remember for our grants and many other grants that you need to match your request. So if you're asking for $10,000, your total grant budget is going to need to be at least 20 because you need to match those funds. Your cash match are expenses that are paid for with funds other than the New Jersey Council for the Humanities funds, and also very importantly, other than the National Endowment for the Humanities funds. Other federal funds can be used to match any NJCH funds, but the National Endowment for the Humanities funds cannot. And that is because our funds also come from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So in-kind match is the value of goods or donated goods or services, volunteer time, etc. So things that are not actually paid for, but come to you free of charge. So I mentioned that we have assigned some values here for how much these things cost. Assigning value is always something that is difficult. Certainly if it's a person, you need to speak to them about the value of their time and how much they charge. Market value of goods and services is completely reasonable way to find your grant amounts here. Very important, because we see this a lot, don't underestimate the value of your volunteer time. We see this undervalued a lot. There is a website called Independent Sector, which has a lot of information about the value of national volunteering. It can be broken down geographically and has lots of other info about this. The last time I went onto this website, which I confess was a number of months ago, and I think it was the 2018 estimates that I last looked at, the value of basic volunteer services, nothing special, no specialized services at all in New Jersey, statewide was $28.10. It's a little higher in the north and a little lower in the south, but $28.10 is average for the state of New Jersey 2 years ago. We get people estimating volunteer time at $10 an hour. That is much, much too low. We ask that you do your best to provide realistic estimates of how much things cost, and that is because the amount of the value you assign for costs is what's going to determine how much you're asking for. You want your grant requests to be as realistic as possible, because if you get funding, that's ultimately going to be the maximum amount of funding that you get. So if it turns out that you budgeted, for example, here, $5,000 for your project scholar, as Piscataway Public Library did, and she costs $10,000, you're now $5,000 short, which is going to make it a lot harder to do your project. So once you have these initial estimates here, you're going to have to put them into your actual budget. And that's what I have, whoops, on this page. So these are the costs. This section A that I have here are the costs that they determined. And then they're going to start putting it into what they're requesting from the grant versus other funds, right? The matching funds. And there's two, as I mentioned, two columns for that. One is your cash, which are the other funds, this section right here. And then the other is your in-kind. These are donated goods and services, volunteer time, as I mentioned. So the Piscataway Public Library actually chose a really simple grant option. They were only asking for $5,000 total, and it was all for their project scholar. This is not the only way to set up a budget, but this is how they set up their budget. You can see that the time of the primary library staff who will be involved, the project director, the library director, and an adult services librarian, their time is estimated based on a percentage of their full salaries during the time of this grant. I think this, if I'm remembering correctly, this was a 6-month grant. They had some travel, oops, I forgot to put this in here. They had some travel and lodging costs that also came out of the library's budget. And you can see down here as you get into supplies and services, they anticipated some expenses for food, which they're paying for out of other funds, not the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. But they got their marketing materials donated. So that's in the in-kind column. And this brings us down to the totals for their grant. You can see it was a $5,000 request, and they've matched it, more than matched that, with $6,398 in expenses and $400 in funded expenses and $400 in in-kind. So, yes. Do we have any questions at this moment? I'm actually going to take a little break here for questions, because I know the budgets are complicated.
We have a couple questions. One is from Levi Fox. So he asks, in South Jersey, it would be reasonable to use $25 per hour for any volunteer. That is correct. I will say the one sort of caveat with that, well, not caveat, if you have people that have specialized skills, for example, an attorney or some other sort of specialized skill that might charge higher market rates, you can use that rate as a sort of guide. So that's just sort of for like $25 is for like general volunteer services, like if you have docents who are giving tours. But if you have someone that's volunteering a sort of more specialized skills, you can use a higher rate. So that's sort of more for general. So that's the sort of minimum, and you can kind of go up from there. Another question, I may have missed this, but does that match have to be another grant source, or can it be cash on hand that organization plans to budget towards staff time, project, etc.? And I had another similar question about using a grant for matching funds. It could be all of those. So you could use a grant as the matching funds from another source. The only exception to that, which probably doesn't apply to most cases, if you have funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, you cannot use that for matching funds because it comes from the same source. But you can use other grants or foundation funds that you've received, donations to use as matching funds. It could be from your cash reserves, and you can also use in kind, which is volunteer goods and services for your match.
Yep. We also don't ask you for, at this stage, and very rarely even in reporting, we don't require you to tell us where you're getting your funds. If they're coming from other funds, that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to clarify as well that when we talk about matching, you don't, as you can see from the Piscataway Public Library, you don't need to match every line. The match needs to happen down here at the bottom in the total. Right? In total, you have at least matched the expenses that you're requesting in your grant. That's it. Okay. Wonderful.
Yeah, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
This is my first experience with any kind of grant application, and so it's all brand new, and I'm a little bit confused. First of all, is this sort of spreadsheet part of the actual application, or do you have to devise your own?
We have a spreadsheet. It doesn't look exactly like this, but it looks very similar to this. That is part of the application. When you go on to our application system, there is a downloadable spreadsheet, so you'll see it. Mm-hmm.
All right. So in this instance, the actual grant was $5,000.
Correct.
Okay. So if it were $10,000, the match has to exceed $10,000.
Correct.
Be at or exceed $10,000.
Correct. A minimum 1-to-1. Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Sorry, I may have missed this. The match is that you have to prove that you have equal amount of funds, equal or greater amount of funds elsewhere?
It doesn't have to just be cash. It can be any combination of cash and also in kind being donated goods and services or volunteer time.
So if the nonprofits really, new and really sort of getting off the ground, they probably don't have those resources. What would that entail then?
Yeah, it doesn't even just apply to new nonprofits. It often applies to volunteer-driven nonprofits. In those cases, the match is usually made with the volunteer time. Okay. And in those cases, there's often a lot of volunteer hours that go into a project. If you do not feel confident about your ability to budget, I strongly recommend two things, and I'll talk about both in a minute as well, but signing up for a grant consultation, which you received a link for how to do that when you got your LOI approved, if you did, then sooner rather than later, so you can talk through the examples that are specific to your organization rather than speaking in generalities as we are today. Also, we offer draft review. It is optional, but I highly recommend participating in it if you can. And honestly, we see more problems in budgets than we do in narratives. Yet people always want us to review the narrative and not the budget. So include your budget in draft review if you can participate in it. We can identify problems pretty immediately or see areas where you might not have thought about a particular type of expense that can help you make your match.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Everybody doing okay? I know budgets kind of make everybody's head feel like they're going to explode a little bit. We are here to help your head not explode. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next part, which is actually your narrative. But please, if you have additional questions, let's come back to this at the end, okay? So don't hesitate at all. So in the narrative, there's a bunch of different things we're actually you're gonna be taking a look at. Okay, I'm sorry, just one second. Okay. Okay, so we've outlined our program, we've outlined our budget, and now we're gonna start to outline the narrative. These 5 questions are not exactly the narrative questions that we ask in the incubation grant and action grant for us, but they're the kinds of questions that come up in each of those applications and that more broadly come up in grant applications in general. Who is the project for? How are they involved? This is an audience question, right? What is the problem you're trying to solve or need you are addressing? Why is your organization the one to deal with this question or problem? What will you have at the end of your project? And that can be anything from, for an incubation grant, it might be a plan, to a big series of events or a new exhibition or a book or a website, who knows? It's about, in part, your deliverables, certainly, but also your vision for this project in a longer term sense. How this project is going to help your organization grow or deepen. All of these questions may be relevant to your particular project. And then what does success look like? So for those of you who have some experience doing grant proposals, you know that what does success look like? That question is asking you about evaluation. I want to say, however, that at least for us and for also a lot of other grant makers, we're not deeply anywhere near as interested in your evaluation methodology. I gave a survey is not a great answer to this question. That might be relevant, it might not be, it's hard to say. What we want to know is what you want to learn or what you will see as success. What are the things that will mark your project as successful to you? You are the ones who can determine this. And when you're thinking about what success looks like and what you want to learn from your project, one of the best ways to do that is to go back to what your goals for the project were and say, like, okay, if my goal for this project was to help people understand, as Piscataway Public Library did, the history, their local history, engage with that history and, have more people involved in it, how are they going to know that that happened, right? How are they going to know that there is a more diverse public involved with that? How do they know that more people are going to be involved with and engaged with that collection, et cetera? So those are the kinds of questions that we want to know, right? I'm going to very briefly, we're not going to spend time on this very much right now, but I am going to show you what this might look like in the proposal worksheet that I had, right? So we used the budget worksheet already. We're going down to this outline your narrative section, right? So I've taken some information from the Piscataway Public Library's actual proposal and put it back into these questions that we have here. As you can see, as I'm going through it, I'm using notes. This is not where you want to create beautiful, gorgeous prose. This is where you want to think about what are the bullet points that I want to hit to on my project. The effort for taking the time to do this work in advance rather than jumping directly into your application is that this will make your application easier to write in the end because you will have thought through a lot of these questions, right? So I'm not going to spend, like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to sort of talk about this, what does success look like questions, because I think this is one of the hardest ones to look at. Increased interest and excitement about the collection. They want to see that more people are asking about their collection, the local history collection. They want to identify new leads on the collection items, and they can actually mark how many did they have at the beginning. If they were getting, if they wanted to have another 10 people involved in this, did they get 10 people involved in this project? That's a way of actually measuring the success of their project. At the end of this, they want to have their plan. for the first phase of development and implementation. So they need to have it in hand for that to be successful. And a big part of this was having ambassadors from these target communities, right? They want to diversify the people who are involved with the local history collection. So having actual individuals who are going to be advocates for this collection as they build it in the coming years are ways, again, that they can actually measure their success and show success of their goals of their project. So this is, stop sharing that and go back to our lovely PowerPoint for a moment. Okay. So once we have outlined the narrative utilizing these questions, you'll start jumping into actually writing your proposal. And that takes us to this last thing that well, not the very last thing, but the last major topic that I want to talk about, which is the most common reasons that proposals are not funded. Like I said, a lot of these are specific to the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, but there's usually an equivalent for other organizations as well. For us, I think it's probably number one, is that the project lacks a significant humanities focus. We are the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. Humanities has to be integral for the project for it to be a competitive proposal. Similarly, this might have a similar application for another funder. For example, the Historical Commission, New Jersey Historical Commission, funds New Jersey history. So no matter how cool your project about the history of Georgia is, the New Jersey Council for the, the Historical Commission is not going to fund that. Another big one for us is that the project does not have a public focus. There are parts of the National Endowment for the Humanities that are focused on research and particularly individual academic research. We do not fund those kinds of projects. Public engagement in the humanities is a priority for us. Besides humanities, this next one is probably number two for where projects fall down in our grant applications, which is that the project does not involve the community that it seeks to serve, and/or it doesn't match our audience priorities. We feel very strongly about involving the community you wish to serve instead of working with that community. This has a lot to do with equity. This has a lot to do with organizations having a voice in how their own story, or individuals having and communities having a voice in how their history is told. And we have a particular priority in serving underserved populations and telling untold stories. So all of that kind of fits in this umbrella. I like to build from the idea that is expressed by the Disability Rights Initiative, which is nothing about us without us, right? How can you build a program or implement a program with your audience rather than for your audience? So I mentioned this briefly, but I want to go into it a little bit more. Your narrative and your budget don't match. This is a big problem when this comes up. It doesn't come up a lot, but when it does come up, it's usually a big problem. When you say you're going to do a bunch of things in your narrative, we need to see evidence of that happening in your budget. To give an example, from a number of years ago, there was an organization that was applying for funding to do walking tours, and they gave an explanation of what their walking tours were. However, when we turned to the budget, almost a third of their whole request was for buses. This was confusing because they were talking about walking tours and there was no explanation of how the buses were going to be used. And it was a huge chunk of the budget. That was one of the major reasons why that proposal was not funded. So finding a good match between your budget, making sure that your budget and your narrative match is really critical. Also, a lack of clarity of what you're going to do. I mentioned this already. We need to know not only why your topic is important, but also what you're going to do to address that topic. This is particularly important with action grants, but it's relevant no matter what. To give a very silly example of this, if you were to say you want to create a program that addresses the enormous polarity in our political system right now, right? Everybody's the polarized political system right now. That makes sense. That sounds like a good humanities project. But if you say you're going to do that by taking everybody to Great Adventure, you're probably not going to get funding. So what you're doing is equally as important as why you are doing it. And then finally, we get to what I call the passion problem. The passion problem sort of focuses on you making a case for why this project is very important to you, but have not made a great case for why it is important to your audience. There's many variations of this. One of the big ones that we see a lot in history projects is this history has never been told, or we have to do this now because this history is going to disappear. People are dying, those kinds of things. That is a compelling reason to do the work now. It's not a compelling reason to do the work, period. Many parts of history disappear. Most of history is not preserved. So we want to know why is this history important? Why is this work important? Not just for you, but for our public. The humanities exists in a public context. It's always not about the individual, but how the individual exists in the public. Also somewhat related, red flags in proposals include hyperbole, flowery language, and superlatives. The best, the only, it's unique. No one's ever done this before. It's actually rarely true, and sometimes might be because it's not a good idea. A good example of this was, again, from a proposal a number of years ago of an organization that was looking to do an arts and science project that sort of used the humanities to bridge arts and science. And they said that no one in that area, that metro area, had ever done that kind of work before. The problem was that I come from a museum background and I come from history of science museums. And I had, in fact, at 2 different institutions within the last 5 years done history of science and art projects about 25 miles away. So that was a time when saying that they were the only or the unique made them look like they didn't know what was going on in the field instead of supporting their project. So I'm sure there are exceptions to each of those rules, but across the board, those are some of the places where we find that projects fall down. So I have not mentioned yet the #1 reason why a proposal is not funded. And I'm curious to hear if any of you guys have an idea of what that might be. If you have a thought, please put it in the chat. Nothing yet?
Responses. So one is did not follow guidelines properly.
Oh, that is also a good one. It's not the #1, but that is true.
Misses deadline. That is a good reason projects are not funded.
Yeah, it won't even be considered if you miss the deadline. So yeah, true.
This is an interesting one. It is abstract. So I think that's an interesting one is like the project, like the description is too abstract, and that has sort of where it's hard to tell what they want to do. Particularly I think particularly when there's a disconnect between wanting to say we're doing this for the public, but using a lot of jargon, like really heavy academic jargon, is kind of, if you know, here's one. Does not go well. Here's one, which is actually true most of the time. Not enough money available. So maybe you want to address that a little bit more.
Ding, 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 ding. Fantastic. You have won a prize. Don't we wish that it could be? Oh, I think Joy was looking to add something else in as well. Can you unmute yourself, Joy?
Sorry, that's my microphone acting up.
No problem.
Okay, I'm good? Okay. I don't know whether this is relevant or not, but I thought maybe overconfidence. And it relates
I think
to some of the things you mentioned about the
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's related to the passion problem sometimes. That's the like, you know that this project is important to you or to your organization, and that is almost always true. I should say that for sure. It's just really important to make a case for how this is relevant to others.
I'm sorry, I did not hear the ding, ding, ding reason.
The ding, ding, ding reason is the number one reason that proposals are not funded is because we run out of funding.
Oh.
This is really, and I can't emphasize this enough. I know that sounds silly, but it's the number one reason. And I want to give perspective on this so that everyone is very, very clear. And we are not unique in this at all. In fact, we do better than a lot of other funders. In total, we have, in this coming year, we'll have about $400,000 in grants, in grant funding available. We expect to get well over $1 million in requests. So you can see $400,000 available, $1 million in requests, right? There is a big, big gap between those two numbers. Every round of grants is a little bit different. The total number of incubation versus action, the total number, the amount that people are asking for can vary greatly each round. But at best, in the last 4 years, we've been able to fund about 50% in any particular grant round. We're usually able to fund a little bit more in percentage-wise in incubation grants than we are in action grants because we get fewer incubation grant proposals in general. Not always true, but often true. Right now, we anticipate our funding to be around 30 to 35% for most proposals. Now, I can tell you for sure that when you're funding 30% of the grants that come in, that means you're not funding 70% of the grants that come in. 70% means that there are really, really good proposals that are not going to get funded. That's just the reality of it. It's very competitive, particularly at this moment when people really desperately need funding, and our funding has remained stable. We have no additional funding. We're working on it, and we are going to continue to work on it. But that is the reality that we're living in right now. So in a second, we're going to turn to your questions and comments. So if there's anything that you want to go back to or ask clarifying questions about, you can start putting them in the chat right away. In the meantime, please do enjoy one of my favorite humanities memes. We're going to focus in our final questions here on questions that are relevant to the large group. So if you have project-specific questions, the best thing that you can do is sign up for a grant consultation. And I really recommend that you do that if you're applying for a grant right now, that you do that as soon as possible. Those slots will fill up, and there's a limited number of hours in a day. We will not be able to necessarily add additional slots. So do it sooner rather than later. Mm-hmm.
I put the link in the chat. Everyone who's had an approved LOI so far, if you haven't, I've approved most of them. There's a few left. People who submitted yesterday have not approved yours yet. Everyone who's submitted before yesterday, yours has been approved. You should have received an email that has the link. I put the link in the chat below. As Gigi said, we have limited time in the day, so this syncs with the calendar. So if the time shows up on the sign-up form, that time is available, so you don't need to confirm. This is just the easiest way to do it. Just click through the link. All the times listed in, all the times shown on the sign-up form are currently available.
Yep.
So we received 76 LOIs. We have 76 approved. 76 LOIs. Most of which will be approved. So we're going to have a lot of meetings. So definitely sign up soon. If you have questions, I have a question which I think is a good one, but something that probably could actually be its own sort of workshop. And I actually have two questions that are very related. So I'll read them both. Both of these could actually be their own hour-and-a-half workshop on their own.
It might be. We're doing lots more workshops in 2021, so stay tuned. Yeah.
Okay, so the first one is, please describe the different levels of community engagement during the conceptual design of the project.
Ooh,
and then the other one, which I think is related, question, how does NJCH define community, or do you want us to define community as it relates to our project?
Yes.
So excellent. I think they're related. So
Yes, they are very related. So great questions. I'm going to take the second one first. You are defining the community for your project. We want you to tell us who your project is for and why. So that is important. We can talk about what typical underserved and underrepresented audiences are, but you're going to know better in your area, in your institution, in your whatever, your focus, who you're focusing on. And different levels of community engagement, that really is its own hour-and-a-half workshop, that it really is the work of a lifetime. But to briefly think about this, there's a lot of different ways to think about engaging your community. If you put up a flyer at your local grocery store saying that there's this humanities program, there's this literature, right? There's a literature discussion group happening at your organization. You have made a simple way to try to engage your community. You went to a non-humanities based institution, right? A community-based institution, and you put up a flyer and said, hey, you can come and do this, right? That's sort of a very basic level of community engagement. It doesn't guarantee a lot of success. It's nice, it certainly is easy to do, but it's not getting you deeply into your community. On the other end of the spectrum are the one-on-one relationships that you have with representatives of a particular community or with representative organizations of a particular community. You have a long-standing, ongoing relationship with a particular community. So, and sort of like every step in between there is taking you closer to having a long-standing relationship with that community. The closer you can get to that like ongoing relationship is the more competitive you will be. That doesn't mean that you are working with this particular institution and that's your primary way that you're doing community outreach. You might also put up a flyer in your local grocery store, no problem. But if this community is really who you're targeting with your project, reaching out to them becomes your highest priority.
thank you, Gigi. I just want to say one quick thing about the grant consultation sign up. So I included the link in the chat. I would just ask, if you're not applying in this round, I'd ask that you just wait until the round is over, because as I said, we're going to have 70 LOIs plus draft reviews. So I just please, if you're not applying for a grant in this round, just wait until the next round. Just ask you late, because we'll be very busy sort of answering and working through the questions of people who are applying in this upcoming round.
Something that James and I both do is sort of in between grant rounds, we're happy to chat with you and brainstorm ideas. We love to do that. And we have, particularly December and January are rather quiet times for us. So if you want to get something on our calendars now, we're happy to talk about it, and we'll set up a go-to meeting and have a great time.
Here's a good question. Are there other examples of support materials available? Is there a limit to how many photos can be allowed and are videos allowed?
Yes, that's a great question. Support materials, when we're talking about optional support materials related to our grants, we have 2 spaces for you to upload support materials. That doesn't mean you can only link 2 things. For example, using the example that you just gave of photos, if you put together an album of photos and linked to that, you can have as many photos as you want. A word of caution about support materials. When reviewers are reviewing your applications, they will definitely look at your support materials. However, if they are extremely long or extremely dense, they will not get a close read. As an example, one time an organization had their full proposal and also attached a 100+ page strategic plan, I think it was. And I can tell you, like, I took a quick glance through it. I'm not one of the reviewers, but I took a quick glance through it. I know our reviewers didn't read it either. So limiting the things that you attach and making them super duper relevant is better. Support materials have never gotten anybody a grant. The narrative and budget are what get people a grant. Another way to think about support materials is there something that I wasn't able to cover in the narrative or in the budget? That should be your support material.
Yeah, I would say generally things that are directly related to your project. For example, if you have an exhibition, you can put the exhibition plan in there. Things that are a little less relevant are like You know, sometimes we get stuff that's like social media, like a flyer from an event 3 years ago that's not related at all to that. I mean, it's not very particularly useful, to be honest. So I would just sort of keep it on things that like have a direct relationship to it. It could be a report, for example, if you did. I talked to somebody yesterday who was designing a new audio tour, an accessible audio tour. That would be a good thing to include. They've already designed the tour. They're applying for an action grant, so it's an implementation grant. So that also shows that they have put a lot of thought into this prior. They're not in the planning stages. They are ready to implement. It's probably not going to get a close read by all the reviewers, but it does show a level of like, okay, they have a clear plan for what they want to do. So those kinds of things are very useful for supplemental materials. A lot of marketing materials are typically not useful, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. I recall there was a question at the beginning about how proposals are evaluated. So I want to go over that very quickly. Again, I'm going to speak specifically to the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. There's a different process in a lot of organizations, a lot of different grant makers. But many of us have a process that is similar to what we do. We use a peer review process. So we have a grants committee, which is responsible for reviewing proposals and making grant awards. James and I work on the grant program, but we do not make decisions about this. What we are here for is to help you submit your proposals and then to help our grants committee function, like so that they can get all of the proposals that they have and they have all their evaluation materials that they need, but then the decision is in their hands. The grants committee, it sort of grows and shrinks depending on the number of proposals. So right now it is growing. It consists of members of our board of trustees, as well as what we refer to as external reviewers. These are people who are working in humanities, usually vocationally, but sometimes avocationally. So sometimes it's a long time hobbyist in the humanities, but people who have a lot of experience in different parts of the humanities. We try to vary the parts of New Jersey that they're from. We do have some evaluators coming from outside, but usually close. So we might have somebody from Philadelphia, we might have somebody from New York, but we're probably not going to have anybody from Wisconsin. We want them to have a certain familiarity with our state and the kind of work that happens here. We try to vary their background. The humanities is a big umbrella. When you have everything that covers from like history and literature to like jurisprudence and linguistics, that's a lot of stuff. And it's a lot of very different expertise that's needed. So we try to have people of different backgrounds. We try to have people from the different types of institutions that we work with. We work with a lot of libraries. We work with a lot of museums. We work with colleges and universities. We work with institutes. We work with city government agencies and county government agencies. So we try to have some representation of all of this and sort of collaborate together into a committee that can have the diversity of the kinds of programs that we have. They are reviewed by the committee individually. They are scored against the scoring rubric. The scoring, by the way, on the incubation grant page and on the action grant page, they're separate for each one. You can look at the criteria. It is in our grant guidelines. That is used for scoring. It includes humanities content, it includes audience engagement, it includes capacity. You can read it all right there. So take a look at it and you'll see that the scoring relates very closely to the kinds of questions that are asked in the narrative. So you can see right there what criteria there are for scoring each project. It's scored then, and then the committee actually meets together, previously in person, but now currently via Zoom for the next year at least, to discuss the projects and come up with a slate of recommendations. They're ranked, scored, and then we basically start at the highest scores and fund until we run out of funding. That's how that happens. This is one of the reasons why we recommend that you get feedback from us. We can send you written notes of what the committee discussed if your project is not funded. And in certain cases, the reality might be if we had $10,000 more, you would have been there. So that's, it's helpful to know how your proposal could potentially be improved so that you can bring it back in the next round or next year or whatever.
Gigi, I have a question. Somebody sent me in chat. It's
Right.
about this is sort of about less about the application itself and more about what happens if you get a grant award. And I think we can't really cover that in depth, but we can kind of go a little bit over about what to expect after, if you were to be funded, what to expect afterwards.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when, in a very simple way, and I promise you I'm not trying to be glib, if you submit a proposal, we expect you to do that project that you proposed. We recognize that projects are always, they're living, breathing things, right? You're doing your best to estimate your expenses. You're doing your best to think about, your project plan. Things might happen, absolutely. But we expect you to do as close to the project you have proposed as possible. That is what has been approved for funding. And if you can't do that project, you really shouldn't apply for the funding. What if your humanities scholar moves to Brazil? Fine, you can get a new humanities scholar with similar expertise. That's no problem. However, if you apply for a project that is about, the history of the blueberry in New Jersey, we don't expect you to do, we don't want to see at the end a project that is about the history of the cranberry in New Jersey. That is a different project. You will, in a more sort of brass tacks basic way, you will first sign a contract to say, yes, I agree to these funds. You'll let us know if anything has changed along the way before we sign our contract and everything like that. And that becomes our legal document, right? Connecting the New Jersey Council for the Humanities and ultimately the National Endowment for the Humanities to your organization. We are, and then you start working on your project. We give 90% of your grant upfront. And we can give, usually that means you get a check for 90% right up front. It does go up to $10,000. So we can only give up to $10,000 at a time. So you may get a second check about 3 months later for the balance of the 90% if it's a larger one. And then we reserve the final 10% for the end of your project. In between, you will submit an interim report, which will give you the opportunity to tell us what has happened. It'll be due, we will determine that date based on your grant timeline. It'll be about halfway through. And you will determine, you will give us an update on what's happened so far, how your spending's going. Are you on time? Do you think you're going to need an extension? Do you have any significant changes to your budget? All those kinds of things that may come up at other times during the process as well. You can always ask us questions or talk to us about issues that you have. But that's a moment to look at it. And then at the very end of your project, when your project is done, you'll submit a final report that summarizes the work that you've done. You attach any materials that might have been developed, and you give us a final accounting of your expenses. That's a very simple version of this, but we're almost out of time. So hopefully that hit the high points, if nothing else.
I just want to say one thing too, is that if you're applying in this round, this is the first round we're using a grant application system. The entire grant will be managed through that, from the letter of intent to the final report. The login credentials that you've created, you can log in there to see the different aspects of it throughout the project. You'll be able to see, for example, when payments have been sent. So if you create an account, definitely bookmark that site and remember that password, because you'll be able to manage your entire grant throughout the entire process. So we've done it a little bit differently before. So this, you just log in, you'll be able to see everything within there. The grant, your letter of intent. Once you get the award, you'll sign the award through there, the award agreement. You'll submit the final report through there. You'll submit the interim report through there, etc. So if you have any questions, we can cover that during grant consultation, or you can just write me an email. You can just write us an email at grants@njhumanities.org. I have a good question from Samuel Robbins that wants you to talk. It's I'll just read it out loud. I'm always nervous about submitting too much of a project for a grant that I've worked on, only because I worry it will look like you've done this much without a grant. Why do you need a grant? It's also hard to produce parts of a project when you need resources to produce these parts. How often are grants awarded that are used as recompense for parts of projects already produced? How much should I have prepared to bring to a grant proposal process? And there's a sort of second part. I also am typically looking to pay myself for a project as director choreographer. How often is personnel salary used for these grants, and how often are independent artists, creators utilizing these grants in conjunction with public programs or other non-for-profits?
Yeah, so there's some, those are really important questions. And there's a few different levels on them. So past work cannot be supported by any of our grants. When you apply for a grant, and this is in our grant deadline information as well, we put when your grant project can begin. And it can start within 1 month of your award deadline, of your award notification. So in this particular grant round, you'll receive award notification by the end of December. Your project can start as early as January 1st, and it has to start within 3 months. So it'd have to start by the end of March. Your grant period that you determine, up to 12 months for an incubation grant, up to 18 months for an action grant, is the time period where you'll be doing the work for your grant. It's very important to think about this in terms of your grant specifically. In many, many cases, as Samuel mentioned, these projects are ongoing, right? There's already work that's been done, and probably after the grant, there'll be additional work to be done. Your grant is when the expenses related to the money that you've received in your grant are taken up. So it's that period that we're talking about, those expenses that we're talking about. Any expenses that were incurred prior to the grant period that I mentioned, and any after the grant period, cannot be included with your grant. So that's very important.
I just want to say, as a clarification, you can't use it for matching funds either. So both the request and matching funds need to take place within the project period.
Yes. And so past work and future work beyond the grant period cannot be included anywhere in your budgets. So that's very important. The example that I used from the Piscataway Public Library is a good example of this, because they had already done some of the work related to this grant project, right? They had already started looking at their collection, their existing collection, and noting the where the gaps were, and you don't see that work in the budget that they proposed and in the work plan that they proposed. They're focusing on this very specific 6-month period where they're bringing in this external person to help them with this project and conducting these public meetings. That's awesome. So that's a good example of the grant project versus the larger project. So that's very important. Another thing about this, the other part of this question was about how often can you use your grant essentially to pay yourself? And the answer is often. The vast majority of funds, the single largest expense in the vast majority of projects that we have are the people, right? Humanities work happens because people do the work. There's not usually a lot of expenses besides that. I mean, cookies only cost so much. Even pizza only costs so much. So expenses for individuals, be they part of your organization or external people that you're hiring in for a specific project as like a consultant, are completely reasonable expenses. They are reasonable expenses to be asked for in the grant, and they are reasonable expenses to be used as matching funds. With this particular example, the caution that I would have is we do not support the creation and performance of art. There is overlap between the arts and the humanities, certainly, but the overlap exists in the history, interpretation, and criticism of art, rather than in the creation and performance of art. It's a really, it's particularly because of how much more support there is for the arts in New Jersey than there is for the humanities. It's one that we hold to pretty closely.
Yeah, for example, in past years, the Arts Council has a budget of $16 million. We have a budget of $8 million. So there's a huge order of difference. So while there, as Gigi said, there's a lot of overlap, there has to be sort of a significant critical interpretive part of an arts-based project for it to be competitive. There's a part I
Same
don't
for
know.
social services projects, by the way, I should mention. There's overlap between social services and humanities, but again, and also social sciences and humanities. But again, we're looking for those the lovely little the part where the Venn diagram connects. For your if that relates to your individual project, it's a good thing to talk to us about if you're not certain about it. Was there another question?
Yeah, I guess there's a sort of another part to this. I guess it's a question of like, if you've already done a lot of work, I guess the essential wording is like, if you've already done a lot of work, would that make it seem like your project is less competitive?
No, that is completely irrelevant, at least for us. I can't really speak to another organization's priority in this, but no, that would be irrelevant.
I mean, often it can work in your case, like in your favor, particularly action grants, which about implementation. If you show up with a sort of, a incomplete, plan, you're not going to get funded. But if you've shown that you've done a lot of preparation and planning for an action grant, then that will work definitely in your favor.
Absolutely.
I guess I'm not really sure.
Just really quickly, James, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I do want to say that we are actually a little bit past our time. So if you have to go, I just wanted to for one moment say thank you for being here. Please reach out to us with questions that you have. If you want to talk for the future, talk to us in December and January in particular. I hope you have a wonderful day. There will be a recording. I saw that come up. Again, resources page of our website, njhumanities.org/resources, or scroll to the bottom of the website and click on the resources link. You'll see a whole section that'll take you to both recordings and other resources from this. I have some more stuff that we're gonna email out to you after this, a sort of summary of things that I talked about, and they'll also be available on that website for the indefinite future. I'm sure we'll eventually rotate things off, but it'll be there. Also, if you have not signed up for our monthly opportunities and events email, please, I highly recommend that you do. You can do that on the website. Follow us on social media. For us, it's Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And yep, that's where you usually get the information about additional workshops that are coming up. We're planning a lot of workshops in 2021, both that are specifically grants related and are also about capacity building, digital program development, evaluation. We try to help people build out skills as much as possible. And I won't be the only one talking for once in these as well. So I'm sorry, I'm happy to continue to answer questions, but of course, go if you need to go.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us today, and definitely reach out. I put the resources link. We're getting a lot of thank yous in there, so I'll place the resources link again. And again, if you are applying for a grant in this round and want to schedule a meeting with GGRI, please sign up for a grant consultation. As I said, I'm going to post the link again, but it syncs with the calendar, so if the time is available, one of us will be available to speak at that time. So I'm going to put that in again. So if you're applying in this round, you can sign up for a meeting in the You Can Book Me link, and they will send you details to log into a conference call or video, depending on your preference. So there's two options for video meeting or phone meeting. The login details are in there for both. I would just ask that if you sign up for one, please don't show up to the other. So it happened the other day, someone signed up for a phone call, but joined by video. So I called the line and no one was there. So it makes it a little challenging. So yeah, thank you everybody. We'll stick around for a moment if you have any questions for us. But yeah, I'm gonna stop the recording, Gigi. Does that sound good?
Sorry?
I'm gonna stop the recording. Does that sound good?
That's fine. Great.
Okay.